Chapter 3 of The Airplane Boys Among the Clouds by John Luther Langworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by P.J. Morgan. Chapter 3 The Men in the Touring Car. When Andy Bird, wet through to the skin, arrived at the fisherman's dock a little later, he found quite a crowd awaiting his coming. The small urchin Tommy had apparently not suffered seriously from his immersion in the waters of Sunrise Lake. Perhaps he was to some extent accustomed to tumbling overboard, though this time the consequences might have been most serious only for the lucky presence of the bird boys nearby, intent on trying out their new hydroplane. Tommy's mother managed to thank the rescuer after a fashion, but Andy was a modest lad and made light of his recent adventure. "Don't mention it, fellas," he laughed when Larry and Elephant started to lavish praise on his head. "I'm thinking of sending in an application to become a member of the life-saving corps on the Great Lakes, you know, and this was just the finest chance ever to try how things worked. Besides, someday Frank and myself may have to take a header from an aeroplane, and it's just as well to know how to drop." "Well, all I can say is that you did it as well as any expert," observed the occupant of the tonneau, who had given the name of Mr. Marsh. Andy looked at him, noticing for the first time that strangers were present. "Thank you, sir," he said, blushing a trifle, for he was as yet hardly accustomed to praise and quite unspoiled. "But there comes Frank with the machine. Did you see us rise from the lake, fellas?" "Did we?" exclaimed Elephant, with his face beaming. "Well, I should smile we did now. It was the greatest stunt ever. I thought at first, Andy, something had happened to your new biplane, but these gentlemen knew all about such things and they explained to us what you meant to do." Andy at this stole another side glance at the occupants of the big touring car. Noticing this, Mr. Marsh hastened to remark, "Well, that is putting it rather strong, my boy. We've been interested in several aviation meets during the last year, and keep posted as to what is new along those lines. Plenty of people know about hydroplanes and such things, and so this represents the last thing in your work, does it? I must say you are a credit to your teacher, whoever he may be." Frank, who had landed close by, heard these words, as possibly the gentleman intended he should. But he was too much interested in other matters to pay any particular attention to the flattery of passing tourists. "How did Tommy come out of the accident?" he asked. "All right, I guess," laughed Andy Bird, his cousin. "His ma's carried him off into the house to fill him up with cake or bread and molasses. He didn't swallow more than a pint of water." "Lucky Tommy," observed Mr. Marsh. "He made the drop in fine shape, Andy," Frank went on, still keeping his face turned toward his chum, as though not really caring to enter into conversation with these unknown gentlemen who seemed to be so well posted on things aeronautic. "It was a peach of a dive!" exclaimed Elephant enthusiastically. "And since you're wringing wet, I don't think you'd better go up with me again right now," Frank continued. "Hike for home and get into some dry duds. I'll knock around for a spell to try out a few more stunts I have in mind." Truth to tell, Frank was eager to get his new hydroplane away from those searching eyes of Mr. Marsh. They gave him a queer feeling, which of course he was quite unable to understand. During the preceding summer, when the bird boys were using the monoplane they had put together so successfully, it chanced that they had had quite a serious adventure with a couple of thieves who had robbed a jewelry establishment and were trying to get out of the country, where the roads were being closely watched by the police. On this occasion, one of the rascals chanced to be a man named Jules Garrone, who over across the water had been something of an aeronaut and aviator. Conceiving the brilliant scheme that if the monoplane of the bird boys could only be stolen, he and his companion could easily elude their hunters, he had given Frank and Andy lots of trouble before finally falling into the net. That was one reason why Frank felt rather cool towards strangers who manifested undue interest in his work. He was of an inventive turn of mind, and believed he had several new features connected with this hydroplane that as yet were, so far as he knew, novel to the science of aviation. And those keen eyes of Mr. Marsh gave him an uneasy feeling. "Your biplane seems to be built especially for two," remarked that gentleman as he watched Frank swing the machine around with the help of the willing Larry and Elephant. "Yes, sir," replied the boy promptly. "Andy and myself always hunt together. We are called the Siamese twins because we won't be separated. Where one bird boy is found, you can make up your mind the other isn't very far away. Once on a time they got to calling me Smoke and Andy Fire, but we just wouldn't stand for that." "But possibly your machine may not fly quite so well with only one to balance." Was that a broad hint that he would be only too glad of an invitation to occupy the seat left vacant by the departure of Andy? Frank suspected such a thing, and made a quick reply. "Oh, we've got all that arranged to a dot, sir." He laughed. "I can change my seat and still reach every lever easily. And as to balancing, the time has come when the aviator is going to be freed from all that anxiety. Give me a start, will you, fellows? It's easier rising from the water than on land, because no stumps or roots get in the way there. That's it. Good day, sir." There was a whir of the powerful little Kincaid engine, the lightest ever installed in an aeroplane, and immediately the new biplane started to take on speed. When in the estimation of the one who handled the flyer it had attained sufficient momentum, the planes were elevated, and like a great bird it gracefully began to mount upward into space. Larry was watching the two gentlemen in the car, who had been paying the closest attention to every little detail. He saw Mr. Marsh turn his head and nod several times quickly to his companion. "As neatly done as I ever saw it accomplished," the gentleman muttered, though the sharp ears of Larry Geohagen caught the suggestive words. Then, after a few pleasant words to the two boys who had been fishing, the men in the touring car started off, heading toward town, and were speedily lost to sight in a cloud of dust. "Let's take the shortcut and bring up at the field where Frank and Andy do pretty much all their practice turning and cutting figure-eights," suggested Larry, as though he had a purpose in saying this. "Oh, I guess I'm still able to toddle that far," remarked Elephant, who was compelled to work his short legs very fast when trying to keep alongside the taller Larry. And yet these two, so unlike in almost every way, had long been known as inseparables, ready to have an occasional little spat, yet just as quick to pour oil on the troubled waters again. "There's Andy turning out," remarked Larry after a while. "Perhaps if you could only get going a little bit faster we might overtake him before he reaches home. I reckon he means to head for the shop in the field, because I know he always keeps a lot of old duds there." "Sure thing," assented the dwarf cheerfully as he started on what was for him very like a run. "And it would be just like Andy to want help when Frank comes along with the new biplane. Say, ain't she a dandy, though? Did you ever see such a neat contraption? Guess them gents thought we had some pretty smart fellows in Bloomsbury." "That's just what I was thinking, Elephant," remarked Larry. "But here we are at the edge of the old field, and Andy just ahead. See that? He's aiming for the shop in the middle of the patch, where the hangar lies that holds their old monoplane. Perhaps you could buy that cheap now, Elephant. You know, you always declared you meant to take up flying some day." "Haven't given it up yet, either," returned the other doggedly. "Well, I advise you to think it over good and hard. Remember the fate of Darius Green. It needs a mighty active fellow to manage one of those tipsy, cranky machines. And if you ever should fall out, I bet you there'd be an awful squash," chuckled the tall boy. "Let up on that, can't you?" expostulated Elephant. "I'm small, but I can get around as well as the next one, and when I get to sailing through the air, I expect to have wings. Then, if any accident comes along, it's me to flap my feathers and drop like a thistledown. In other words, Larry, I've got a parachute all arranged that will let me down easy, just like the fellow at the county fair who drops from a hot air balloon." "Hello, now what do you think of that?" claimed Larry suddenly. "What do you mean?" demanded the small boy. "You're the most mysterious fellow ever. Oh, I see now, by the way you stare over yonder. Yes, it's the same two gentlemen who admired the daring of the bird boys a little while back. They must have found out where Andy lives and have run out here from town to see what sort of a hangar they have." "Yes, that's right, but I don't like it, I tell you," Larry went on as he led the way over the fence that surrounded the field. "What's that?" cried Elephant. "Sure you don't suspect these two fine-looking gents might be another pair of crooks like the one that tried to steal Frank's monoplane last summer, do you?" "Oh, rats, you wouldn't understand it if I did try to explain. There they go now in a cloud of dust. Guess they saw us pointing at the car. Come along, Slowpoke, and get up with Andy. and Larry linked his arm in that of his comrade, though he had to stoop considerably in order to make the connection. "Why, hello, fellas!" exclaimed Andy, who now for the first time became aware of the fact that they had been trailing after him.
"Just dropped around to see if we could be of any use putting the new machine away,"
remarked Elephant, as if an apology were needed to account for their presence. But both boys had always been accounted special friends of Frank and Andy, and warmly greeted, though not taken into the secrets of the shop, where mystery reigned much of the time of late.
"And there's Frank coming right now,"
declared Andy.
"I guess he made up his mind he didn't care to put her through all her paces with me away. We're sure proud of this new one, fellas. Why, she works like a clock, and minds her helm better than anything that ever answered to the call of the plane."
"Say, did you happen to notice that car on the road over there?" asked Larry.
"I saw one moving along in a cloud of dust, but didn't notice who was in it. Why do you ask that?"
answered the young aviator, looking at his friend curiously.
"Oh, well, it happened to be those same two men you saw when you brought little Tommy ashore,"
remarked the other mysteriously.
"But I thought they were headed for Bloomsbury,"
exclaimed Andy.
"That's what they said, but you see they thought it worthwhile to run past and come away out here, just to take a peek over the fence and see what you bird boys had in this section."
"That's funny now," muttered Andy, who, being less keen than his cousin, could not let suspicion find lodgment in his brain as quickly either. "But perhaps Frank may know who they are. He keeps pretty well posted on everybody connected with aviation meets and inventions. Marsh, he said his name was. What was the other, do you know, fellas?"
"I heard him call the man at the wheel Longley several times, so I reckon that must be his handle,"
said Elephant, who never liked being left out in the cold whenever there was an argument on the carpet, or in fact any talking being done. Frank came sailing directly toward them with considerable speed. When it began to look as though he might mean to collide with the low workshop close by, he suddenly swooped upward and passed over their heads, uttering a laugh as he saw how the alarmed Elephant dropped flat on his face and hugged the earth. Circling around, Frank cut several fancy figures with the new biplane, the hum of the twin propellers making merry music in the ears of the delighted boys. Finally, as though tiring of this sport, he dropped on the grass as lightly as he had a little while before nestled on the smooth surface of Sunrise Lake. The three boys joined him, and willing hands soon stored the aeroplane in the snug hangar prepared for it alongside the workshop. Then Andy dodged inside to change his clothes before he got a chill, for though summer had come, the air was far from hot right then by any means, a storm having cleared the atmosphere during the preceding night and leaving it delightfully crisp.
"I saw a car buzzing along the road while I was up, but couldn't use my glass to see who was in it. Did you notice, Larry?"
Frank asked as they stood there near the open door of the shop.
"I was just going to mention the fact that those two men act like they had taken a great fancy to you and Andy," returned the other readily.
Frank Bird frowned.
I just don't like to hear that,"
he said.
"Andy and myself have been working on something lately that we want to keep a dead secret from everybody. If we don't tell even our friends, then there can be little chance of a leak. But I'm not inviting strangers to take a ride with me or visit us in our shop. Though you can come in now any time you want, Larry and Elephant."
"Sure, we wouldn't know the wing feather of a plane from one that belonged in the tail or steering rudder," chuckled Larry.
"But I'm meaning to learn, Frank,"
put in the small chap strenuously.
"It looks so easy for you fellows knocking around up there with nobody ever getting in your way, like on our roads, that I want to fly."
"Well," pursued Frank, shaking his head, "I don't encourage anybody to take up the business. It's certainly the most dangerous calling going at present, but after the Wrights have put their latest balancing idea into general use, the number of dead aviators will drop fast. In time, it may be a fellow can hardly fall out of a well-made flying machine if he is the most reckless aviator going."
"Hear that, Elephant?"
laughed Larry.
"Hope yet that some of us common truck may be flapping through the upper currents and getting out of the wet when it rains by sailing above the clouds. But I see some fellow coming along the road on his wheel like he had a hurry call. Looks like Nat Holmes, too, and he's coming in here."
"Funny how badly balanced that fellow is," remarked Frank. "Always in a hurry in everything he tackles, and then falling all over himself when he tries to talk. He's waving his hat, too, like he had something interesting to say. Let's hope, boys, it happens to be one of his good hours, or we're in for a lot of gibberish Hottentot patter, I'm afraid." End of Chapter 3. Recording by P.J. Morgan.